28 years after Raccoon City, people are dying from the outbreak that never really ended. An FBI analyst, a veteran agent running out of time. A secret buried beneath the ruins of a city that was never supposed to be found again. This is Midnight Lore. Long game stories told slowly for sleep. Subscribe and let the next one find you. Now, let's go back to Raccoon City.
Get comfortable. Let everything slow down. This story begins not with a hotel in the Midwest, not with a dead body, or a missing police officer, or two strangers converging on the same nightmare. It begins much earlier than that. It begins with a company and an ambition, and the particular kind of scientific arrogance that believes the most dangerous thing in the world can be controlled if the people controlling it are smart enough. They were not smart enough. No one ever is. The Resident Evil universe is built on a very specific kind of horror. Not the supernatural kind, not the cosmic kind, but the entirely human kind. The horror of institutions that prioritize profit over safety. The horror of governments that fund things they should not fund because the potential strategic advantage outweighs the potential for catastrophe, are at least in the calculations of people who will not personally bear the consequences of being wrong. The horror of brilliant people who believe that their brilliance exempts them from the ordinary rules of caution and restraint. The Umbrella Corporation is the embodiment of all of this. On the surface, it was a pharmaceutical company, a global giant, one of the largest and most respected in the world, with products ranging from ordinary consumer goods to cutting-edge medical research. The umbrella logo, the familiar stylized design that became one of the most recognizable corporate symbols in the world, was attached to things that people used every day. Cosmetics, household products, medications. The brand was everywhere. Underneath that surface, in the classified research divisions, and in the facilities that did not appear on any public documentation, in the work being done by scientists who had been recruited specifically for their willingness to pursue things that more ethically constrained researchers would have refused. Umbrella was something very different. The company's founders were not simply pharmaceutical entrepreneurs. They were, in their way, true believers in a particular vision of human potential. A vision in which biological manipulation, taken far enough, could produce capabilities that normal evolution had never provided. Spencer, one of the founding figures, was a man whose ambitions extended beyond simple corporate success into something more difficult to categorize. He wanted to change what humanity was. He believed that the tools to do it existed in the biological world, awaiting to be unlocked by sufficiently determined scientists. The progenitor virus was the foundation of everything that followed. Found in a specific species of flower in the mountains of Africa, studied in secret by the early umbrella researchers, it was the raw material from which almost every subsequent development in the company's terrible research program was derived. The progenitor virus had properties that no naturally occurring biological agent possessed. It could rewrite the genetic structure of organisms that came into contact with it, producing changes that ranged from the profound to the catastrophic, depending on the specific organism, the specific viral strain, and the countless variables that the early researchers were still learning to understand and control. From the progenitor virus came the T-virus. The T stands for tyrant, a designation that says something important about the ambitions driving the research. The T-virus was a modification of the progenitor strain, engineered to produce specific effects in human hosts. What those effects were depended on the specific subject, the specific viral load, the specific circumstances of exposure. In some cases, the virus produced enhanced physical capabilities, strength, durability, resistance to damage. In other cases, in most cases, in fact, it produced something else entirely. It produced zombies, not metaphorical zombies, not the cinematic shorthand for a cultural anxiety. Actual reanimated human beings, stripped of most of what made them human, driven by a biological compulsion to feed that overrode every other cognitive function. The T-virus, when it infected a normal human host without the specific genetic factors that would have produced something different, converted that person into something that was neither alive nor dead in any conventional sense. Something that moved, that responded to stimuli, that was capable of spreading the infection through bites and contact, but that possessed none of the higher cognitive functions that made a person a person. This was not a side effect that Umbrella was unaware of. It was, in a terrible sense, a feature. One aspect of what the T-virus could do, studied and documented, and in some cases deliberately deployed in facilities where the researchers wanted to observe infection dynamics without the complications of ethical oversight. William Birkin was one of the key figures in this research. A brilliant virologist, one of the most talented scientists Umbrella had ever recruited. He spent years working on derivatives of the T-virus in pursuit of something more controllable, more powerful, more capable of producing the specific kinds of enhancement that Umbrella's military clients were interested in. His G-virus, named like the T-virus, with a designation that spoke to ambition rather than accuracy, was the product of years of work, a modification that produced even more dramatic changes in its host than the T-virus had. The G-virus was also, as would eventually become clear, catastrophically dangerous in ways that made even the T-virus look manageable. Birkin's work was being done in a facility beneath Raccoon City, a Midwestern American city that served as Umbrella's primary research headquarters in the United States. The city had been shaped around Umbrella's presence over decades, in the way that company towns are always shaped around their dominant employer. The people of Raccoon City worked for Umbrella, or worked for businesses that served Umbrella's employees, or lived in the specific kind of comfortable insularity that comes from a community that has never had to think too hard about where its prosperity comes from. The Raccoon City Police Department had its own relationship with Umbrella, one that the ordinary officers of the department did not fully understand, but that some of their superiors were very much aware of. The department operated out of a building that had originally been an art museum, a grand structure whose architecture spoke to civic ambition and cultural aspiration, and that had, over time, had been repurposed in ways that said something different about what the city had become. Underneath all of it, underneath the city, underneath the police department, underneath the pharmaceutical company's public face, was the truth, the research, the experiments, the accumulation of biological materials and modified organisms and classified documents that represented decades of work in pursuit of capabilities that no ethical framework could have sanctioned. And in 1998, that truth came to the surface. The specific sequence of events that led to the Raccoon City Incident involved multiple actors with multiple agendas, but the root cause was simple. The T-virus escaped containment. The specific mechanisms of that escape, the deliberate sabotage, the corporate treachery, the chain of individual decisions that each seemed defensible in isolation and were collectively catastrophic, are themselves a story worth telling. But the end result was what mattered. The T-virus spread through the city. The population was infected. The thing that the research had always theoretically been building toward, the deployment of a biological weapon in an inhabited area, happened accidentally in Umbrella's own company town, to Umbrella's own employees and their families. The zombies did not stay in the underground facilities. They moved through the city streets. They moved into the buildings. They moved through the places where people lived and worked and tried to understand what was happening to them. And the infection spread in the way that infection spread. Exponentially, unpredictably, far faster than any official response could address. The government's response was a decision that said everything about the priorities of the people making it. Rather than attempt a containment and rescue operation that might have saved some of the city's population, they chose sterilization, a missile strike. Raccoon City was bombed into rubble on September 29th to 30th, 1998, and everything in it, the buildings, the research facilities, the underground laboratories, the documentation of what had been done there, and the people who had survived the initial outbreak and might have been saved if saving them had been the priority, was destroyed. And the official story was a carefully managed version of events that acknowledged the destruction of Raccoon City while attributing it to causes that did not implicate the government's own involvement with Umbrella. The truth was classified at the highest level. The people who knew the truth were scattered, some silenced through official channels, some through less official ones, some simply living with the knowledge of what had happened and the impossibility of talking about it openly. Some of them survived. A handful of people who had been in Raccoon City during the incident and had gotten out through extraordinary capability, extraordinary luck, or both, carried the truth with them into the years that followed. They were changed by it. How could they not be? The specific kind of trauma that comes from watching a city die are from fighting through streets full of the infected, from understanding at first hand what the world had decided it was acceptable to do in the name of strategic interest. That kind of trauma does not resolve. It accumulates. Leon S. Kennedy was one of those survivors. He was 21 years old on his first day as a police officer in Raccoon City. He had no idea what he was walking into. He came out the other side of it someone very different from the person who had arrived. Grace Ashcroft's mother was in Raccoon City too. Alyssa Ashcroft was a journalist, a survivor of the outbreak who made it out through a combination of skill and endurance that left its own marks. What happened to Alyssa in Raccoon City? And what happened to her in the years after? is part of the story that connects to everything that follows. Because the thing about the Raccoon City Incident is that it did not end in 1998. The bombing destroyed the city. It did not destroy the virus. It did not destroy the knowledge of how to create the virus. It did not destroy the people who had been infected and survived with mutations rather than transformations. And it did not destroy the institutional structures, the governments, the corporations, the research programs that had created the conditions for it to happen. Those things persisted. They adapted. They continued in different forms, under different names, in different locations. The destruction of Umbrella Corporation as a legal entity, which followed in the years after Raccoon City, as the company's involvement could no longer be completely hidden, did not end the work that Umbrella had been doing. It distributed that work, as scattered it among successor organizations, rival corporations, government programs that acquired Umbrella's research through channels that were not always transparent. The years between 1998 and the present day of Resident Evil Requiem's story, 28 years, are years in which the consequences of what was done in Raccoon City continued to spread. Not always visibly, not always dramatically. Sometimes in the form of isolated incidents in places where the documentation was thin, and the media coverage was thin, and the public never quite connected the events to the larger pattern. Sometimes in the form of individuals who carried the biological legacy of the incident in their own bodies without knowing it. The T-virus does not always produce immediate dramatic transformation. In some hosts, under some conditions, and it produces something slower, something that sits in the body and changes it gradually, over years rather than hours, something that only becomes visible in the form of black wounds, in the form of specific physiological changes, in the form of a slow deterioration that has no natural explanation. Much later, when the original source of infection is ancient history and no one is looking for the connection. 28 years is a long time. Long enough for the survivors of Raccoon City to have built lives, however imperfect, in the aftermath of what they went through. Long enough for the children of those survivors to have grown up, to have developed their own relationships to a history that shaped them without their direct participation in it. Long enough for the specific biological consequences of a night in 1998 to become, some people, a time bomb that has been running down ever since. This is the world that Grace Ashcroft and Leon S. Kennedy are operating in when the story of Resident Evil Requiem begins. A world that believes, mostly, that the worst of the Raccoon City aftermath is over. A world that has moved on, in the way that worlds always move on from their worst moments, through a combination of time and forgetting, and the practical necessity of continuing to function. A world that is about to discover that moving on is not the same as things being over. Rest now. The nightmare begins soon. Welcome back. Let everything slow down. In the last part, we established the foundation, the Umbrella Corporation, the viruses it created, the night in 1998 when the T-virus escaped into Raccoon City, and the government chose to solve the problem by destroying the city rather than the virus. The survivors who walked out of the wreckage carrying knowledge they were never meant to have, and trauma that would never fully leave them. Now we move forward. 28 years forward to October 2026, and we begin with a disease that no one was looking for, found in people no one was watching, spreading through a population that the world had mostly forgotten still existed. Raccoon City Syndrome. That is the name that eventually gets attached to it. Once enough cases have accumulated that the pattern becomes undeniable and someone has to give it a name. RCS for short, in the clinical documentation. Something more personal in the minds of the people it is killing. The mechanics of it are this. The T virus in certain hosts did not behave the way it was expected to behave. The expected outcomes were two: transformation into the violent, infectious undead state that Umbrella's documentation categorized as zombie infection, or death from acute immune response. These were the outcomes that had been observed in Raccoon City, documented in the research files, studied and understood to the degree that anything produced by Umbrella's chaotic final months could be called understood. But there was a third outcome that Umbrella's researchers had noted in their files, and then, apparently, are not pursued. In a small number of hosts, the T virus did neither of the expected things. It did not trigger rapid transformation. It did not kill the host in hours. Instead, it established a latent presence, embedding itself in the host's biology in a dormant state, invisible to the immune system, undetectable by any standard diagnostic approach, sitting in the body like a seed, waiting for conditions that would allow it to activate. 28 years is a long dormancy, long enough for the host to believe genuinely and understandably that they had escaped the worst of what Raccoon City could have done to them, long enough to rebuild lives in the aftermath of a trauma that the world had mostly agreed to classify as a contained historical incident rather than an ongoing biological crisis. Long enough to have children and to establish careers, to develop the specific kind of careful, ordinary existence that people build when they need to believe that the worst thing that ever happened to them is genuinely in the past. And then the virus activated. In some hosts, something. The specific biological circumstances are complex enough that the researchers who eventually studied the phenomenon could not identify a single reliable trigger, caused the dormant T virus to begin its work. The symptoms were distinctive once you knew what to look for. The black discoloration of tissue at the infection site, spreading slowly through the surrounding biology, the specific physiological changes that marked the progression, the trajectory, once activated, that led toward the same endpoint as acute infection, just much more slowly. The people who were dying of Raccoon City Syndrome in October 2026 were dying of something that had been inside them for nearly 3 decades. They were dying of Raccoon City, just on a delayed timeline. And the people responsible for tracking what happened to Raccoon City's survivors, to the degree that anyone was responsible for this, which is itself a question with a complicated answer, had not been looking for this specific outcome because no one had told them to look for it. 5 bodies before the story begins. 5 survivors of the 1998 incident, dead of black wounds, their physiological state upon death consistent with the specific kind of biological failure that had no natural explanation for anyone who did not know what to look for. Other deaths were scattered geographically, the survivors of Raccoon City had not stayed in one place, had in fact been deliberately dispersed by various institutional arrangements that had their own reasons for wanting them separated from each other and from any easy path to collective organization. The pattern in the deaths was not obvious from a distance. It became obvious when someone started connecting the dots. Victor Gideon had been connecting the dots for some time before the story's events began. He was not a government researcher or a public health official or any kind of institutional actor whose job it was to notice patterns in unexplained deaths. He was a former Umbrella Corporation scientist, someone who had worked on T-virus research in the years before the Raccoon City Incident, and who had deep knowledge of what the virus could and could not do, and who had spent the 23 years since Umbrella's legal dissolution pursuing his own research agenda in a facility he had acquired specifically for this purpose. The Rhodes Hill Chronic Care Center had been owned originally by the Spencer Foundation, the charitable arm of Oswell Spencer's personal empire, the face he presented to the world when he wanted to be seen as something other than the man who had funded the development of bioweapons. Gideon purchased the facility after Umbrella's dissolution and transformed it into something that looked, from the outside, like a legitimate medical institution. It was equipped with everything a legitimate medical institution would need. It employed staff who, in most cases, I believed they were working at a legitimate medical institution. The things that were actually being done in the facility's restricted areas were not the kinds of things that the public-facing staff knew about. Gideon had identified Raccoon City Syndrome before any official government body did, because he had access to Umbrella's research materials and because he had spent years studying the long-term effects of T-virus exposure. He knew what to look for, and when he found it, his response was not to report it through official channels or to work toward treatment and prevention. His response was to plan around it, to identify which specific outcomes of RCS would serve his purposes, and to position himself to take advantage of those outcomes when they materialized. His purposes were connected to something called Elpis. Elpis. The name is from Greek mythology, the spirit of hope that remained in Pandora's box after all the evils of the world had escaped, was Gideon's obsession and his goal. It was, as it turned out, not what he believed it to be. But we will get to that. For now, what matters is what Gideon believed, that Elpis was a biological agent of enormous power, something that Spencer had been developing in the final years of his life, something that required a very specific key to access, and that key was a person. Spencer's final years were not public knowledge. After Umbrella's dissolution, after the revelation of at least some of what the company had done, Spencer had retreated from public life into a kind of isolated twilight existence, living in one of his many estates with a small staff and very little contact with the outside world. And he was old. He was aware that the world had judged him and found him culpable for things he was, in certain private moments, not entirely willing to disavow. And in this period, he did something that was, by his standards, almost sentimental. He found a child, an orphaned infant, whose origins and whose specific biological status were connected to the research that had defined his life's work. He placed her in the care of a journalist he had agreed to speak to, a woman named Alyssa Ashcroft, a survivor of the Raccoon City outbreak who had been trying to tell the story of what had happened there for years. He entrusted Alyssa with the child, with instructions that could be described as a wish rather than a directive. He called it his legacy. He called it his requiem for the dead. The child was Grace. Grace Ashcroft grew up knowing none of this. She was Alyssa's daughter, not biologically, not legally, until the formal adoption was arranged through Spencer's estate after his death in 2006. But in every meaningful sense, Alyssa was her mother. The specific facts of her origins, whatever they were not information she had been given. She knew that her mother was a journalist. She knew that they moved frequently, following Alyssa's freelance work. She knew that her mother was careful about their exposure in ways that Grace did not fully understand until much later. She did not know that Victor Gideon had been looking for her since 2004, when he came across Spencer's research notes and found a reference to the child, to the specific biological inheritance that made Grace, in Gideon's reading of Spencer's incomplete documentation, the key to accessing the Ark, the facility where Spencer had stored Elpis. October 19th, 2018. Grace was 10 years old. She and Alyssa were staying at the Wrenwood Hotel, a building that had been in operation for 90 years, a grand old structure in a Midwestern city that had seen better days, the kind of place that accumulates history and the particular kind of quiet that comes from being a place where many people have passed through on their way to somewhere else. Alyssa had work in the area. She had suspected, in the days before, that someone was watching them. The hooded man who came for them that night was infected, a T-virus carrier used as an instrument by Gideon, sent to capture Grace and eliminate Alyssa. The power went out. The hotel manager was killed in the lobby. Alyssa fought. She had survived Raccoon City, and she was not a person who stopped fighting when things got dangerous. She shot the hooded man. She hid something behind a painting. She took Grace toward the emergency exit, telling her daughter that she would explain everything once they were out. She did not get out. The hooded man dying from his gunshot wounds caught up with them. Grace watched her mother die in front of her. She was 10 years old. The fire that started from the lamp knocked over in the struggle consumed a wing of the hotel. The building was closed. Grace spent 8 years building a life around that night without being able to look directly at it. She joined the FBI, not as a field agent, not as someone who would ever be put in a position of physical confrontation if it could be avoided, but as an intelligence analyst, as someone who processed information and built assessments from behind a desk. The skills she developed were real. Her value to the Bureau was genuine. But the specific choice of institution, the specific career path, was not unrelated to the specific events of 2018. She was looking for something, even if she would not have described it that way. In October 2026, a body was discovered at the Wrenwood Hotel, the fifth in a series of deaths, all survivors of Raccoon City, all presenting the same distinctive black wound characteristics, all dying of the same condition that no official medical framework had yet classified or named. The hotel was being prepared for demolition. The body had been placed there deliberately by someone who knew exactly what it would trigger. Grace Ashcroft's supervisor, Nathan Dempsey, gave her the assignment. Investigate the death at the Wrenwood Hotel. Face the place where her mother died. He framed it as an opportunity for closure, the kind of well-intentioned professional suggestion that supervisors sometimes make without fully understanding what they are asking. He was not entirely wrong about the opportunity. He was, in ways that the story will eventually reveal, not working with complete information about what was actually happening. Grace went alone. An intelligence analyst with no field experience and no backup, going into a condemned building where her mother had been killed. She had a gun, bought privately, not issued, because her position did not typically require one. She had her training, as she had the specific kind of courage that comes from being afraid of something and doing it anyway, because not doing it has become worse than doing it. What she found inside the Wrenwood Hotel was a room full of photographs of herself, of her mother, a careful, deliberate arrangement that spoke to years of observation by someone who had been watching her from a distance, waiting for the right moment. Victor Gideon had not stopped looking for her in the 8 years since Alyssa's murder. He had simply been patient. He took her, rendered her unconscious before she could fully understand what was happening, infected a local police officer with the T virus, triggering the beginning of an outbreak in Wrenwood that would serve as cover for his escape, and took her to the Rhodes Hill Chronic Care Center, and where the next phase of his plan would unfold. Sleep well. The nightmare has found her. Now it has to find Leon too. Welcome back. Settle in. Let your breathing slow. Grace Ashcroft woke up in a room she did not recognize. This is one of the oldest and most reliable horror situations. Waking in an unfamiliar place, disoriented, without clear information about what happened or how much time has passed. For most people, this would be terrifying enough. For Grace, who had spent 8 years building a careful, controlled existence in the aftermath of watching her mother die, who had constructed her professional identity specifically around the kind of analytical distance that kept the worst of what she had experienced at arm's length, this situation was precisely the thing she had been organizing her life to avoid. She was tied to a bed. The room was dim, the kind of dim that comes from medical facilities at night, and the ambient glow of monitoring equipment and emergency lighting creating a pallid imitation of visibility. There was a medical device behind the bed. There were progress notes on the table beside her. The notes referred to her by a patient number rather than a name, which said something important about how the people who had brought her here were thinking about her. She was in the Rhodes Hill Chronic Care Center. She understood this before she had confirmed it explicitly, from the architecture and the equipment and the specific quality of institutional silence that permeates old medical facilities. She had done her research. In the weeks before the Wrenwood assignment, she had built files on every significant location and individual connected to the string of Raccoon City Syndrome death. The care center had appeared in those files. Victor Gideon's name was attached to it. She got free. This is Grace Ashcroft's first demonstration of the quality that will define her throughout the game. Not combat capability, not the kind of physical confidence that Leon Kennedy brings to every situation he walks into, but a specific kind of methodical resourcefulness, the analyst's habit of assessing what is available and constructing a path forward from whatever the situation provides. She examined her restraints. She examined the room. She found what she needed. The facility she moved through in the early stages of her escape was not yet fully in crisis. The outbreak that Gideon would trigger, the deliberate infection of the care center's staff and patients with a mutated T-virus strain, had not yet happened. The hallways were institutional, unslightly uncanny in the way that all facilities that exist at the intersection of care and control tend to be uncanny but functional. There were staff members, there were other patients, there was the specific kind of ordinary that can exist right up until the moment it stops existing. The fuse box near the locked gate, the missing component that blocked her immediate progress, was the first of the practical problems that defined Grace's experience in the care center. She could not simply move forward. She had to understand the obstacle, identify what was needed, locate it, and return. This is the rhythm of her sections throughout the game, and it mirrors something true about her character. She is not someone who forces her way through situations. She navigates them. She finds the path that the situation itself contains, rather than imposing one from outside. The girl found her. The girl is the monster that pursues Grace through the care center, and it is one of the most effectively designed horror elements in the game. It is not a zombie. It is not one of the infected patients or staff members who have been transformed by the T-virus into the conventional antagonists of the Resident Evil series. It is something that Gideon's experiments produced, a human being who was subjected to things that should not be done to human beings, whose resulting mutation created something that looks wrong in a way that is difficult to articulate precisely and impossible to ignore. The girl moves through the care center differently from the infected. It can stalk Grace through walls. It can pursue her across the ceiling. It is immune to normal damage, and which means that the standard survival horror response, shoot the thing until it stops moving, does not apply. The only reliable approach is to avoid it, to manage its awareness of Grace's position, to understand its movement patterns well enough to be somewhere else when it comes. There is something deeply uncomfortable about this, and it is intentional. The girl is not simply a gameplay obstacle. She is a person who was done something terrible to. A patient of the care center who became a subject of Gideon's research in ways that she did not consent to and could not have anticipated. The horror of encountering her is not separable from the horror of understanding, gradually, what was done to her to produce what she has become. Grace's emotional response to the girl, the combination of fear and pity that shapes how she relates to the creature pursuing her, is part of what makes Grace a different kind of protagonist from Leon. Emily is a blind girl. She was held in the care center as one of Gideon's experimental subjects. Her specific relationship to the work being done there, the precise reasons she was chosen, are part of the information that Grace assembles through the documents and notes scattered through the facility. She is pale, quiet, and self-possessed in a way that does not entirely fit her circumstances, as though whatever was done to her, however long she has been here, she has made a kind of accommodation with her situation that is almost more unsettling than distress would have been. Grace finds her. Emily, who cannot see, who navigates the facility through sound and memory and whatever other senses she has developed in the absence of sight, is nevertheless aware of what is happening around her in ways that prove unexpectedly useful. She knows the facility. She knows its rhythms and its dangers. She becomes, in her own way, a resource that Grace did not anticipate having. The relationship between Grace and Emily develops quickly, in the way that relationships in crisis tend to develop. There is no time for the gradual accretion of trust that normal circumstances provide. They need each other in the immediate practical sense, and the necessity of cooperation creates its own kind of bond. Grace's protective impulse toward Emily, which will define their relationship throughout the rest of the game, is not simply plot machinery. It connects to things that are true about who Grace is, about the specific losses she has experienced, about what it means to her to be in a position to protect something that needs protecting. Meanwhile, Leon Kennedy was driving to Wrenwood. Leon at this point in the story is a man carrying a significant amount of weight, and not all of it is metaphorical. The grey deterioration on his hand, the marks on his neck, the specific physiological symptoms that he has been aware of for long enough to have developed a functional relationship with them. Not denial, because Leon has never been someone who deals in denial, but the particular kind of compartmentalization that allows a person to keep doing what needs to be done, while the situation they are actually in remains unresolved. He knew about Raccoon City Syndrome before the events of the game began. He had been briefed through the DSO, the Division of Security Operations, the elite federal counter-bioterrorism agency that Leon worked for, on the deaths of the Raccoon City survivors. He and Sherry Birkin had been investigating the pattern, following leads, trying to understand what was causing the deaths and who, if anyone, was responsible for creating the conditions that produced them. Sherry Birkin. The name carries 28 years of history. She was 12 years old in Raccoon City, the daughter of the scientist who created the G-virus, infected by her own father in his mutated state, rescued by Leon in the chaos of that night. She survived, and her survival left its own marks. Biological marks, specifically, are related to the G-virus exposure that had been managed and monitored by government medical teams ever since. She became a DSO agent herself. She became Leon's handler, his connection to the institutional structures that provided support for the work he was doing. The relationship between them is one of the more quietly significant things in the game. Not romantic, not simply professional, but something shaped by a specific shared history and the specific kind of trust that comes from having survived something catastrophic together when you were both much younger. Leon trusts Sherry with things he does not tell other people. The information about his own infection, the specifics of what his physical situation actually was something he managed through her. He arrived at the Wrenwood Hotel to find that Grace was already gone. The police officer who had been infected by Gideon, Norman Cole, who had been doing his job at the hotel perimeter when Gideon hit him with a dart, who had been in the process of transforming when Grace encountered him inside, was part of the chaos that had allowed Gideon to escape with her. Leon saw enough of the situation to understand the shape of it. Victor Gideon, Grace Ashcroft, the care center. He drove to Rhodes Hill. The care center, when Leon arrived, was already in the early stages of crisis. Gideon had triggered the outbreak. The deliberate infection of staff and patients with the mutated T-virus strain that transformed his facility from a place of questionable medicine into a place of active horror. The Code 6 announcement over the facility's speaker system was the last normal thing that happened before the infected began to move. The nurse who led Leon toward Gideon's office did not survive the journey. A chainsaw-wielding infected doctor was responsible for that. This is the moment when Leon's sections of the game announce their character. The action horror approach, the combat-forward engagement with threats, the specific kind of capable aggression that comes from a man who has been fighting bioweapons-created monsters since he was 21 years old and has had almost 3 decades to become very good at it. He found a chainsaw. He used it to get through doors that were otherwise impassable. This is very Leon. Somewhere in the care center, separated from him by a locked gate, and Grace was navigating the same building from the opposite direction. They found each other at that gate. A brief, charged meeting. Strangers who had been converging on the same nightmare from different angles, each carrying information the other did not have. Leon passed her his Requiem revolver through the gate. A weapon made for this specific mission, designed to put to rest what should not still be moving. He gave it to her because she needed it more than he did at that moment, and because the specific design of the care center meant they were going to be separated again immediately. Leon found Victor's office. The hidden elevator behind the painting in the director's office led down to a private space where Gideon had kept the documentation that no public-facing medical director would ever display. And the report on Raccoon City Syndrome on his computer was clinical in its presentation of what was happening to the survivors, and clinical in its presentation of what was happening to Leon specifically, whose infection had progressed further than the file's notation of his symptoms suggested he had been letting on. A note ending with the phrase "for the sake of Elpis" connected Gideon's research to something larger than the care center, something that Gideon was building toward. Leon's infection was confirmed in his own hands, by his own eyes in Gideon's private files. He had known, at some level, what he was dealing with, seeing it documented, seeing the progression mapped out, seeing the trajectory charted, was a different kind of knowing, the kind that demands a response, even from someone as practiced at compartmentalization as Leon S. Kennedy. The care center was not yet done with either of them. Emily needed to be gotten out. Grace's escape route needed to be established. Gideon's next move needed to be understood. And outside the facility, in Wrenwood and Rhodes Hill, and the various institutional spaces that connected to the investigation, the larger picture was still only partially assembled, but the shape of it was becoming clearer. Victor Gideon, the care center, Grace Ashcroft's specific biological status, a thing called Elpis, and behind all of it, the long shadow of Raccoon City and the decisions that were made there 28 years ago. Sleep well. The worst of the care center is almost over. What comes next is somewhere much more familiar and much more terrible. Welcome back. Get comfortable. Let the world outside go quiet. The Rhodes Hill Chronic Care Center was falling apart. Not metaphorically. The outbreak that Victor Gideon had triggered, the deliberate infection of the facility's staff and patients with a mutated T virus strain, was producing the kind of rapid environmental deterioration that tends to follow when the people responsible for maintaining an institution are either dead or in the process of becoming something that no longer cares about maintenance. The care center, which had presented itself to the world as a place of treatment and care, was revealing itself to be what it had always actually been underneath. A facility built to contain things and do things to them, now losing the ability to contain. Grace needed to get Emily out, and she needed to get herself out. And these two goals were connected, but not identical. Emily's specific situation, the specific ways in which Gideon's experiments had affected her, meant that the path out for both of them was not simply a matter of finding an exit and walking through it. The three quartz pieces, the moon quartz, the sun quartz, the star quartz, were the mechanism. The door that required them was the obstacle. This is the care center in its final section. A building where the solution to every problem requires understanding the building itself, requires the specific kind of patient, methodical engagement with the environment that is Grace's defining quality. The infected chef was one of the most memorable specific threats, not because of what he was in biological terms, but because of the specific dark humor of what Gideon's experiments had done to him. The satiety suppression medical records that Leon found in the attic described subjects experiencing impossible appetite, weight gain, a transformation of the body's relationship to hunger that had been part of whatever Gideon was studying in the facility's restricted areas. The chef who had become something enormous and predatory was, in some sense, the logical endpoint of that research. A person who had been made into the thing that happens when appetite is freed from every restraint. Leon moved through his sections of the care center with the particular efficiency that 3 decades of experience in exactly this kind of situation produces. Where Grace navigated, Leon cleared. Where Grace evaded, Leon engaged. The chainsaw that a doctor had tried to use against him became, as these things do with Leon, a tool rather than a threat, and the enemies in his sections were formidable. The care centers infected were not simply zombies in the traditional sense, but products of Gideon's specific research, affected by specific modifications that made them behave differently from the T-virus infected of the Raccoon City Incident. But formidable was not the same as insurmountable. Victor had them separated deliberately, and he made use of the separation. The scene where Leon was kept captive in the medical supply room, Victor himself conducting the interaction, assessing what Leon represented as an obstacle to his plans, told Leon things about Gideon that the file he had been given on the former Umbrella researcher had not fully captured. Gideon was not simply a scientist with questionable ethics. He was a true believer. He believed in Spencer's vision, the way that disciples believe in the founders of religions. Not with the critical distance of someone who has examined the evidence and found it compelling, but with the complete commitment of someone who has organized their entire identity around a specific understanding of what the world is and what it should become. Victor escaped from that encounter. He left Leon in the room with a problem to solve, which is also a characteristic choice. Gideon, throughout the story, uses obstacles and environments as extensions of his agenda. Trusting that the complexity of his facilities and his plans will do work that direct confrontation would not reliably do. The helicopter escape from the care center failed. This is another characteristic moment in the story. The obvious solution, the clear path out, disrupted by circumstances that the obvious solution had not accounted for. The helicopter came down in the cemetery outside the facility. Leon, watching from a different position, moved to help. The infected that had gathered at the chapel gate were a problem that required his specific capabilities to address. The chef, arriving with the last wave, was dispatched with the specific combination of available resources and ingrained combat instinct that defines Leon's approach to everything. Grace and Emily made it into the chapel. Leon fought what needed to be fought outside. And then the care center section of the story reached its most emotionally complicated moment. Emily's condition had been deteriorating in ways that were visible and that Grace could not stop, and the experiments that Gideon had conducted on her had consequences that were not reversible simply by removing her from the facility. What she became in the locked ward, the mutated form that the T-virus modifications produced in her specific biology, was something that Leon had to shoot. He had to shoot Emily, not because he wanted to, because the alternative was worse. This moment sits at the intersection of several things that the story has been developing. The way the infected in this game are written, sometimes begging the player to kill them, calling for help, apologizing, warning the protagonist to run, raises the question of what it means to end a life that has been altered beyond recovery. Leon has been living with this question since 1998. He is very, very tired of having to answer it. Grace left with Victor and Zeno. Zeno. The name had appeared in documents and references throughout the care center sections, without a face being attached to it. A name associated with the Connections crime syndicate, with the institutional power that had arranged for the investigation to be handed to the FBI, and for Grace specifically to be put on the case. Now he was present in person, and his presence was unsettling in a specific way that the story leans into deliberately. He looked like Wesker, not exactly like Albert Wesker. The resemblance was not a disguise or an imitation, but something else, something that suggested a specific origin rather than a specific intention. He moved like someone who had enhanced physical capabilities. He operated with the kind of confident authority that comes from knowing that the institutions and organizations behind you are powerful enough to absorb almost any complication. He took Grace to Raccoon City. The ruins of Raccoon City are quarantined. The missile strike of 1998 did not simply destroy the city. It created an ongoing administrative and physical reality. a zone of exclusion around the site of what was officially acknowledged as a contained biological incident, where the rubble of what had been a functioning urban area was maintained in a state of sealed abandonment. The official reason for the quarantine was ongoing radiation and contamination concerns from the sterilization operation. The actual reason, as the story reveals in pieces, was the same reason that everything connected to Raccoon City had been managed the way it was managed: concealment. The ARC facility was hidden beneath the ruins, beneath the destroyed streets, beneath the bombed foundations of what had been Raccoon City's buildings, beneath even the level of the city's infrastructure. A facility had been built, or rather, an existing facility had been adapted and sealed, part of the umbrella infrastructure that had occupied the space below the city long before the outbreak, and that had survived the bombing in ways that the surface city had not. The Ark was, in effect, a vault, a place where something had been stored specifically to survive the destruction of everything above it. Leon and Sherry tracked them there. The police station, the building that had been the Raccoon City Police Department, and that Leon had moved through on his first day as a cop, and his last day before the world changed, was now a BSAA observation base for the ARC facility. The BSAA, the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance, had been monitoring the site for reasons that connected to their institutional mandate, but that also, as the story makes clear, connected to information they had been given or had assembled about what might still exist beneath the rubble. Leon returning to the Raccoon City police station is one of the most quietly devastating moments in the game, and the game knows it. It does not make a production of it, does not dwell on the sentiment in ways that would feel manipulative. It simply allows the weight of the location to be present. Leon is in his old building, the building where Marvin Branner tried to hold on long enough to warn him, where he first encountered the specific horror of people he had just been introduced to being something unrecognizable, where the world he had arrived in, the world he had spent 21 years preparing to enter, turned out to be a fundamentally different world from the one he had prepared for. He paid his respects to the fallen. This is described in the documentation rather than shown in elaborate cutscenes, but the specific names, Marvin Branner, the officers, the STARS members, Robert Kendo, are present. The people who did not make it out. The people who are part of the specific weight that Leon has been carrying for 28 years, and that the director Koshi Nakanishi described as visible in Leon's appearance, in the gravel in his voice, as in the particular quality of pessimism that has settled into a person who has seen too much and saved too few. The terminal in the police station gave him access to a recording of Grace and Zeno talking in the east wing of the ruins. The recording was the first time Leon fully understood the shape of what they were dealing with. Zeno's explanation to Grace was detailed, and it was designed to be. He was not simply informing her, but trying to bring her to a specific understanding that would make her cooperative. According to Zeno, based on Victor Gideon's interpretation of Spencer's incomplete research notes, Elpis was Spencer's final and ultimate creation, a highly contagious mind control virus, something that could, if released in the right circumstances, fundamentally alter the capacity of anyone who controlled it to control others. The original Umbrella mission, the transformation of humanity, the eugenicist vision that Spencer had pursued through the entire history of his organization, was not abandoned. It was concentrated into a single project, hidden in a place that was designed to survive the destruction of everything around it, waiting for someone with the right key to access it. The government missile strike on Raccoon City, Zeno told Grace, had not been ordered by the people who officially ordered it. The connections, the crime syndicate that Zeno represented, the organization whose reach extended into the highest levels of governmental and institutional power, had orchestrated it, not to eliminate the infection, not to protect the public, to conceal Elpis, to seal the Ark beneath the rubble, where it could be accessed on their schedule rather than discovered and addressed by the people it was designed to manipulate. Former President Adam Benford had been killed trying to expose this truth. The specific political history of the Resident Evil universe, the presidents, the cover-ups, the specific mechanisms through which the truth about Raccoon City had been managed, was connected to the Ark in ways that the story was now making explicit. Emily, Zeno told Grace, was a clone, one of many. Spencer's consciousness transfer experiments, his attempt to transcend the mortality that even the most ambitious human ambitions cannot ultimately circumvent, had required a vessel, and the vessel had required testing, and the testing had produced failures and partial successes, and the specific haunted quality of a blind girl in a medical facility who navigated the world through senses other than sight. Grace's connection to all of this, Zeno believed, was that she was the successful result, that Spencer's consciousness had been transferred into her, that she therefore possessed, at some level below conscious awareness, the code that protected Elpis's failsafe. He was wrong about this, but he did not know he was wrong, and the wrongness of his belief was not going to become apparent until the Ark itself. Below them, in the sealed space beneath the ruins of a city that had been destroyed to protect a secret, the secret was waiting. Sleep well. Raccoon City is almost ready to give up its last one. Welcome back. Let your breathing slow. Let the quiet settle. Beneath the ruins of Raccoon City, something had been waiting for 28 years. The Ark facility was not built after the destruction of the city. It was built before. Part of the deep infrastructure that Umbrella had established beneath Raccoon City during the decades when the company controlled the city, when the buildings above were only the visible portion of a much larger operation conducted in the spaces below. When the missiles came down in 1998, the Ararchy survived. It was built to survive. The people who designed it understood that the surface was temporary, that what was stored below needed to outlast whatever happened above. The facility had multiple layers, not just physically, though physically it occupied a significant vertical space beneath the rubble, descending through rock that no standard urban search would have penetrated. But architecturally, it was divided into zones that reflected different phases and purposes of the research that had been done there. The bioweapon repository, the research sections, the central chamber where the failsafe mechanism protecting Elpis was installed. Each zone was a document of what had been planned and what had been done. written in the specific language of abandoned infrastructure and preserved research notes. Leon moved through his sections of the arc with the particular focus that comes from a man who has run out of time for anything that is not directly relevant to the immediate problem. His infection had been worsening throughout the care center section and had continued to worsen on the way to Raccoon City. The grey discoloration on his hand, the specific physiological symptoms that Gideon's files had charted. He knew what the trajectory looked like. He had been trained to assess trajectories, and the one he was on was not one that ended with him walking out of a ruin under his own power if it continued much longer. The liquors were in the ark. This is significant as a lore detail and as an emotional one. The liquors, the specific mutation produced by prolonged T-virus infection. The creature that loses its eyes and compensates through extraordinary sound sensitivity, whose appearance in the Raccoon City police station during the events of Resident Evil 2 was one of the most confronting moments of that game. Were here in the facility beneath the city, preserved or descended from the original infected population of 1998, and 28 years, and the Ark still contained the legacy of that night in its most direct biological form. Leon dealt with them the way Leon deals with things, with the combination of technical competence and grim determination that has defined him since he was 21 years old and had no idea what any of this was. His MSBG 500 shotgun, the Requiem revolver that Grace had returned to him, the hatchet that had been a constant companion, the specific tactical intelligence that 3 decades of fighting bioweapons-created monsters provides to someone willing to pay attention. Meanwhile, Grace was with Zeno. The east wing of the ruined Raccoon City police station was where Zeno brought her first, before the Ark itself, as a kind of preparatory briefing. The specific setting was intentional. The police station, the building that represented the surface history of Raccoon City, and the specific institutional failures that had allowed the outbreak to reach the scale it reached, was the appropriate place to explain the deeper history that the surface history had always been built on top of. Zeno's version of events was detailed and in the ways that mattered most to the immediate situation, substantially accurate. The connections had orchestrated the cover-up of Raccoon City. The government, by choosing sterilization over rescue, had made itself complicit in a crime that had been carefully managed ever since. The specific political casualties, Adam Benford's death, the various institutional arrangements that had kept the truth suppressible, were real. The Ark's existence, the specific nature of what it contained, the fail-safe mechanism, and why Grace was believed to hold its key. All of this was accurate in its outlines, however wrong Zeno was about the specific meaning of Grace's role. What Zeno wanted was power, not the kind of power that involves commanding armies or controlling economies, though those were downstream consequences he was comfortable with. The kind of power that comes from controlling what people can know and what they can do about it. Elpis, as Zeno understood it, was the ultimate expression of what Umbrella had always been building toward, a tool that would render conventional resistance meaningless, that would make the question of who controlled it the only question that mattered. He was bringing Grace to the Ark because he needed her, and the failsafe was real. An incorrect password would trigger immediate destruction of the stored material, and the failsafe's design, as Spencer had conceived it, required input from someone with a specific relationship to the project. Zeno's reading of Spencer's notes told him that person was Grace. His understanding of why that was the case, the consciousness transfer theory, the belief that Spencer had successfully installed something of himself into Grace, was the part he had wrong. The orphanage beneath the city was a section of the Ark that told a specific and terrible story. The experiments that had produced Emily and all the others, the failures and the partial successes that preceded her. In the series of attempts that Zeno described to Grace with a casualness that said everything about what the connections considered acceptable, had been conducted in this space. Children who had been treated as vessels. The specific thing that Spencer had wanted to preserve, the specific capability he had wanted to transfer, had required subjects who met particular biological criteria, and the facility had been designed to acquire and process those subjects. The horror of the orphanage section is not the lickers or the infected that inhabit it. The horror is the documentation, the files and notes that Grace and Leon find as they move through, each one a piece of the picture of what had been done here and in what spirit. Spencer's eugenicist vision, the belief that certain human beings were more valuable than others, that the advancement of human potential as he understood it justified the treatment of some people as raw materials for the advancement of others, is laid out in those documents with the specific clarity of someone who saw no need to conceal it because he was writing for an audience that shared his assumptions. Victor Gideon attacked Leon on the way through the Ark. This had been anticipated. Gideon's specific obsession with Spencer's legacy, with completing what he understood to be Spencer's final project, made him incapable of allowing Leon to simply pass through the facility. The attack produced the result that Victor expected and the result that Victor deserved, which were different results. He was apparently killed. This is the first time in the story that Gideon appears to be out of the picture, and the story is careful to maintain appropriate ambiguity about exactly what apparently means in the context of a Resident Evil narrative. Grace and Zeno reached the central chamber of the Ark, the Elpis terminal, the failsafe mechanism. What Zeno had explained to Grace about how the failsafe worked, that the correct password would release Elpis, that the wrong password would destroy it, that Grace held the key because she was Spencer's consciousness transfer success, was structurally accurate while being substantively wrong in the ways that mattered. The password mechanism was real. The failsafe was real. Grace's role in accessing it was real. But Grace was not Spencer's consciousness in a new body. She was not a vessel for anything Spencer had installed. She was an orphan child who had been given to Alyssa Ashcroft as Spencer's final act of something that resembled conscience. Not the elaborate eugenicist project that Zeno had described, but something much simpler and in some ways more devastating. Spencer had wanted to leave something behind. He had wanted to create the conditions for his legacy to be addressed rather than simply buried. The password was not something Grace had been given through biological manipulation. It was something she could derive from who she was and where she came from the specific history that Spencer had set in motion when he placed her with Alyssa, from the specific documents that Alyssa had been given to pass on. This is the information that Zeno did not have, and that Gideon did not have, and that the entire elaborate mechanism of the story, the dead survivors, the kidnapping, the care center, the journey to Raccoon City, had been constructed to obtain or to circumvent. The two antagonists had built their entire plans around a theory of Grace's significance that was wrong in its specifics, while being correct in its conclusion. She was the key, not because Spencer had made her into something supernatural, because Spencer had simply given her the information she would need, encoded in the life she had been given. Grace typed the password. She did not know, at the moment of typing, whether she was releasing a weapon or a cure. Zeno had told her it was a weapon, the specific design of the choice. The question presented at the terminal, the binary between release and destroy, forced her to make a decision based on incomplete information. This is the game's final statement about what it means to act in situations of genuine moral uncertainty. You cannot always wait for more information. Sometimes the situation demands a decision from what you have, and what you have is never quite enough. What came out of the Elpis terminal when Grace input the correct password was not what Zeno had described. It was not a weapon. It was not a mind control virus. It was an antiviral, the most comprehensive antiviral that Spencer's research had ever produced. Something capable of addressing not just the T virus, but the full range of progenitor-derived biological agents at all of the various weapons and modifications that had been built on the foundation that Spencer's original research had established. Elpis was a cure. Spencer, in his final period, in the years after Raccoon City, after the consequences of his life's work had become too visible and too catastrophic to rationalize away, had turned his research toward undoing what he had done, not publicly, not through channels that would have required acknowledging responsibility, privately, obsessively, with the same resources and the same intelligence that had produced the original harm. He had worked on the opposite of what he had always been working on. Whether this was redemption or simply another form of control, the antiviral as a different kind of leverage over a world that had been made dependent on Umbrella's products is a question the story does not entirely resolve. Spencer was not a simple person, even in his apparent turn toward making things better. The specific way he had set up the conditions for Elpis to be accessed, the orphan child, the journalist guardian, the ark beneath the ruins of the city his company had helped destroy, contained its own kind of manipulation, however much it also contained something that looked like regret. But the immediate reality was clear. Elpis was a cure, and Leon was dying of the exact disease it cured. Zeno injected himself with it immediately, and because Zeno was also infected with Raccoon City Syndrome, something he had been willing to risk his life navigating around, hoping that Elpis would solve his own problem along with everything else he wanted it for. He believed, in the moment he injected it, that he was empowering himself with Spencer's ultimate weapon. What he felt instead was the reversal, the enhanced capabilities that whatever his specific biological history had given him, the Wesker-adjacent mutations the superhuman physical qualities, began to disappear. Elpis did not enhance, it neutralized. It addressed viral modifications the way antibiotics address bacterial infections, systematically, without regard for which modifications the host might have considered advantageous. Zeno became ordinary. In the specific context of the ARC facility beneath Raccoon City, with everything that was about to happen, ordinary was not enough. Sleep well. The last battle is almost here. Welcome back. Settle in. This is nearly the end. The ARC facility was falling apart around them, not because of the fighting, though the fighting was about to become very significant, but because facilities that have been sealed for 28 years and maintained only to the degree necessary to preserve what they contain are not designed for the specific stresses that active conflict puts on them. The structural compromises that had accumulated over nearly 3 decades were being tested in ways they could not sustain. Victor Gideon was not dead. This is the moment that the story's careful maintenance of ambiguity about his fate earns its payoff. Gideon had been apparently killed during his attack on Leon in the Ark's lower sections, but apparent death in the Resident Evil universe is a category with a long and complicated history, and Gideon had been conducting T-virus research for longer than most of the people he had crossed paths with had been alive. The specific modifications that his years of self-experimentation had introduced into his own biology, something he had done gradually, carefully, with the patience of a man who believed he was working towards something that justified every risk, had changed what it meant for him to be mortally wounded. He survived, and he arrived at the central chamber of the Ark at exactly the moment when the confrontation between Grace and Zeno was reaching its crisis point. What Gideon overheard when he arrived was the end of Zeno's usefulness to the plan and the beginning of Zeno's understanding that the plan had never included him surviving it. The argument between them, about Spencer, about the connections, about what Elpis actually was versus what each of them had believed it to be, was the kind of argument that happens when two people who have been pursuing the same goal for different reasons discover that their reasons are incompatible. Zeno worked for the connections. He had been sent by the organization to ensure that Elpis was acquired by the people who had the most to gain from controlling it. The connections' interest in Elpis was, in their conception of it, strategic, a weapon of unprecedented scope, something that would shift the balance of power in ways that their organizational interests were positioned to exploit. When Elpis turned out to be a cure rather than a weapon, the strategic calculus changed completely. An antiviral that neutralized all progenitor-derived biological agents was not the kind of asset the connections had been seeking. It was, in a specific sense, the opposite. Something that would undermine rather than enhance the power of organizations that operated in the space that bioweapons-related leverage had created. Gideon's relationship to Spencer's vision was different from Zeno's relationship to the connection's interests, and the specific nature of that difference is what produced the conflict at the heart of the Ark's final sequence. Gideon had devoted his life to continuing what Spencer had started. He had purchased the care center with Spencer Foundation money. He had spent decades studying Raccoon City Syndrome and positioning himself to be present at exactly this moment. He believed, with complete sincerity, that he was carrying out his master's will. But Spencer's will, as revealed by Elpis itself, was not what Gideon believed it to be. The man who had created the T-virus, who had funded the development of bioweapons for decades, who had established the Umbrella Corporation as an instrument of a eugenicist vision for transforming humanity, had, in his final period, turned. He had worked on an antiviral. He had set up the conditions for that antiviral to be accessed by a specific person in a specific way that ensured it would not fall into the wrong hands. His last project was undoing the most catastrophic consequences of all his previous projects. For Gideon, this was incomprehensible. Not the technical reality of Elpis. He understood antivirals. He understood the science. What was incomprehensible was the implication that Spencer, whom Gideon had organized his entire adult life around serving and completing, had rejected the eugenicist vision that Gideon was still committed to, that the master had changed his mind in ways that invalidated the disciple's life's work. This is the specific kind of betrayal that operates at the deepest level. Not someone else doing something to you, but the person you built yourself around turning out to have become someone different from who you thought they were. Gideon killed Zeno. He had grown a tentacle from his amputated left arm. One of the specific modifications that his self-experimentation had introduced, the kind of body horror that the T-virus produces in hosts who have certain genetic predispositions and who have been exposing themselves to modified strains for long enough. The decapitation was quick. Victor Gideon had never been confused about his capacity for violence, only about the purposes he wanted that violence to serve. Grace was wounded. The tentacle that killed Zeno also stabbed her through the abdomen. A functional incapacitation, something that would prevent her from being an immediate complication to Gideon's next moves. She was not killed. Gideon did not want to kill Grace even now, even with his plan collapsing around him. Grace was, in some sense, that his obsession with Spencer had made irrational, still connected to Spencer in Gideon's mind. You do not kill the last connection to the person you have organized your life around serving. He moved to the Elpis terminal. If the antiviral was real, if this was genuinely what Spencer had produced, then the implication for Gideon's vision of what he was doing and why was devastating. But devastating implications had never stopped him before. He began inputting the destruction sequence. The wrong password that would trigger the failsafe would destroy the stored Elpis. If he could not use it for the eugenesis project he had dedicated his life to, he could at least ensure that no one else used it for its actual purpose. Grace used her vial of Elpis to cure Leon. This is the story's central reversal, and it happens in the space between Gideon's distraction and the facility's continuing structural deterioration. Leon had been declining throughout the arc sections. The specific progression of Raccoon City Syndrome that his files had charted was visibly advancing, and the fighting he had done to reach this point had accelerated what the disease was already doing. He was at the limit of what he could sustain. Elpis worked immediately. The antiviral addressing the T-virus infection that had been embedded in Leon's biology for 28 years or rather, addressing the reactivation of that infection that Raccoon City Syndrome represented, worked with the speed and completeness that Spencer's research had engineered it to work with. The grey discoloration on his hand began to clear. The marks on his neck began to fade. Something that had been running down inside him since the night in Raccoon City was addressed, finally, by the thing that Spencer had spent his last years building specifically to address it. Leon stood up with his full capabilities restored, or as close to his full capabilities as a man in his late 40s who had just spent several hours fighting his way through a bioweapons facility beneath a bombed city could be said to have his full capabilities, which, it turned out, was still considerable. Gideon mutated. The specific mutation that Gideon's body underwent in the arc's final section was the product of everything his years of self-experimentation had introduced into his biology, accelerated and destabilized by the extreme physiological stress of the situation, and the T-virus modifications that had allowed him to survive what should have been a fatal wound from Leon now expressed themselves fully, turning him into something that the game's documentation compares to the Nemesis from the events of 1998, the specific kind of massive, barely controlled biological weapon that Umbrella had been trying to engineer for decades. The Nemesis-type mutation is not a random occurrence. It requires specific genetic compatibility, specific viral concentrations, specific conditions of activation. Gideon had been engineering those conditions in himself for years, perhaps without being fully aware of where they were leading. He had been making himself into something, and what he had been making himself into was finally visible. The fight that followed is Leon at his most essential. Not Leon in decline, are not Leon managing his symptoms and conserving his resources because he did not know how much was left, but Leon restored, fighting with everything that 28 years of experience and the full return of his physical capabilities provided. The Requiem revolver, the weapons he had accumulated moving through the arc, the specific tactical knowledge that comes from having faced Nemesis-type mutations before, from Raccoon City, from everything between then and now. Gideon's first phase was the tentacle arm, the electrical charges drawn from the arc's still functional power systems, the massive physical advantage that the mutation had given him. Leon addressed this the way Leon addresses physical advantages, by not engaging on the terms that advantage was designed to exploit: movement, position, the precision shots that the Requiem revolver was built for. The second phase was the full Nemesis transformation, the dissolution of the human-shaped body into something larger and less articulated, the kind of enemy that the Resident Evil series has always reserved for its final confrontations. The arc was collapsing around them. The structural failures that had been accumulating throughout the fighting were now producing concrete, immediate consequences. Sections of floor giving way, support columns failing, the facility beginning the process of becoming one more buried layer in the rubble of Raccoon City. Leon defeated him. Victor Gideon, former Umbrella researcher, devoted servant of a vision that his master had abandoned, collector of Spencer's incomplete notes, director of the Rhodes Hill Chronic Care Center, the architect of the deaths of 5 Raccoon City survivors, and the outbreak at Wrenwood Hotel and the kidnapping of Grace Ashcroft and the infection of countless others melted into puddles. The Requiem revolver's last significant shots. The monster that had wanted to continue Spencer's eugenicist project ended in dissolution, in the specific kind of anticlimactic physical aftermath that biological weapon systems tend to produce when they are no longer being sustained by whatever mechanism had been sustaining them. The facility was destroying itself around them. Leon and Grace, in the specific situation that the story had built toward, a man who had spent 28 years waiting to be in a room where the consequences of Raccoon City could be genuinely addressed, and a woman who had spent her whole life in the shadow of a history she had never been fully told, were trapped in the collapsing arc with no immediately obvious way out. Then the sound of a helicopter, the BSAA's Hound Wolf unit, dispatched by Chris Redfield, the same Chris Redfield who had been involved in the original Raccoon City Incident, who had continued his career as one of the primary institutional responses to bioterrorism through the decades since, who had learned about the ARC facility and about Leon's involvement in what was happening there, and had sent the people who could get them out. The rescue was not dramatically staged. It was simply the arrival of what was needed at the moment when it was needed, which is how rescues actually tend to work. Leon was told that Commander Redfield was looking for him, and the facility continued to collapse as they got out. And outside, in the cold air above the ruins of Raccoon City, the long night was finally ending. Sleep well. The ending is coming. And it is, against all the odds this story has accumulated, something like hope. Welcome back. Let everything slow. You are almost at the end of this story. They got out. Leon Kennedy and Grace Ashcroft, carried by the Hound Wolf unit's helicopter, away from the ruins of a facility that had been buried beneath the ruins of a city that had been destroyed to keep it hidden, emerged into a world that did not yet know what had just happened beneath its feet. The Ark's exposure would become a global story. The specific truth it contained about Umbrella, about the connections, about the government decision to bomb Raccoon City, and the reasons that decision had actually been made, would spend the coming weeks and months moving through the institutions and the media and the public conversations that process these things. But in the immediate aftermath, as sitting in a helicopter with Grace and a cup of coffee, and the particular quality of silence that follows the specific kind of ordeal they had both just survived, Leon told Sherry that he was feeling better. Sherry Birkin. She was also infected with Raccoon City Syndrome. She had been infected from the moment of the G virus exposure in 1998, when her father, in his mutated form, had passed the infection to her, and the long-term T virus component of that exposure had been working its slow way through her biology for the same 28 years it had been working through Leon's. The government medical teams that had monitored her since Raccoon City had tracked the progression. They had not had a solution. Elpis was a solution. The antiviral that Leon was carrying, the extra dose that Grace had ensured they left the Ark with, addressed precisely the biological condition that Sherry had been living with. The smile she gave in the helicopter was not simply because Leon survived. It was because Elpis could cure her. Because the thing that had been in her body since she was 12 years old, the specific biological legacy of the night her father was shot by Umbrella's agents and chose to inject himself with his own virus rather than let them take it, could now be addressed. This is one of the quieter emotional notes in the ending, and it is one of the most significant. The people who survived Raccoon City have been carrying the consequences of that night inside them in a literal biological sense. Leon's greying hand, Sherry's condition, the 5 victims of Raccoon City Syndrome whose deaths began the investigation. The other survivors still out there, unknown numbers of them, who have been living with the same latent infection and who have not yet manifested symptoms but will. Elpis addresses all of them. Spencer's antiviral, applied with sufficient scale, ends the long biological aftermath of 1998 in a way that the missile strike never could. The news reports that followed the Ark's exposure were carefully, institutionally hedged. A bioweapons lab discovered beneath the ruins of Raccoon City. The US president denying involvement. The specific framing that official responses to inconvenient truths tend to adopt. Acknowledging the fact while distancing the institution from the implication. The world had been through this before. It would go through it again. The specific mechanisms of cover-up and revelation and partial acknowledgement and continuing denial were familiar. But something was different this time. Grace's report, the document that she produced in the aftermath, the summary of what she had found and what it meant and what could be demonstrated through the evidence assembled in the investigation, was the first time that a complete account of the Raccoon City incident, from the progenitor virus to Spencer's final project, existed in a form accessible to the public and anchored by documentation rather than theory. The things that had been suppressible before, because the evidence was classified, because the witnesses were scattered, are because the institutional mechanisms of concealment had been functioning for nearly 3 decades, were now documented and connected in ways that were much harder to dismiss. The truth was out, not completely, not permanently beyond further suppression. The specific geopolitical and institutional forces that had conspired to keep Raccoon City's full story hidden had not ceased to exist simply because one document existed, but a threshold had been crossed. Grace Ashcroft, the orphan child of a journalist who had spent her adult life trying to tell this story, had finally told it in a form that could not be recalled. Emily survived. This is the ending's most unexpected note of grace. Deliberately so, given the character's name and the nature of what had seemed to happen to her. Emily, and the blind girl who had been taken captive and experimented on, and who had been shot by Leon in a moment of terrible necessity inside the care center, was found in Rhodes Hill, inside the remains of her mutated form. The biological process that the mutations had subjected her to had produced, in its final stage, something like a cocoon. And from that cocoon, the girl emerged, alive, beginning to recover from what the virus had done to her. She regained her sight. Elpis, applied to her condition, addressed the viral modifications that had produced her blindness and the other consequences of what Gideon had done to her. The specific sense that had been taken from her. Sight. The ability to see the world directly. rather than navigating it through other means, was restored. This is one of the details that the story presents quietly, without fanfare, as if the scale of what Elpis can do is still being understood, and the individual applications of it are still registering. Grace adopted her. Two people shaped by loss. A woman who had watched her mother die at 10 years old and built 20 years of careful distance around that wound. And a girl who had been held captive for reasons that had nothing to do with who she was and everything to do with the biological accidents of her existence. Found in each other the specific kind of home that people who have been through particular kinds of darkness sometimes build together. The two photographs on Grace's desk in her FBI office, one of her and Alyssa, one of her and Emily, are the story's final image of Grace herself, the past that she had been carrying, the future she was now building. Leon put his wedding ring on screen at the end. The director's specific statement about this, that the ring was meant to show that Leon had somewhere to go home to, that there was a peaceful, ordinary life that he hoped players could imagine him returning to, is both touching and quietly revolutionary in the context of who Leon Kennedy has been for 3 decades. The rookie cop who became the DSO agent, who became the man who had outlived everyone who tried to stop him, was going home. To a spouse. To the specific domestic peace that the most capable fighters in dangerous worlds sometimes get to return to, if they survive long enough. Hunk was in the Ark. This detail, which the game's notes and post-game analysis have developed more fully than the main narrative, is one of the seeds planted for what comes after. Aka Hunk, the Umbrella Security Service operative who survived Raccoon City in 1998, by being, in some fundamental sense, the most ruthlessly competent person in the building on the worst night in its history, who had appeared in various entries of the series as an almost mythological figure of professional lethality, encountered Leon in the Ark and was apparently defeated. Whether apparently is doing the same work here that it did with Gideon is an open question. The post-credits scene that appears after the canonical ending, the good ending, the one where Elpis is released and Leon survives, shows masked soldiers returning to the depths of the Ark crater. The BSAA operatives who had been present in the facility had been eliminated. The soldiers radio in that they have acquired their objective and are moving before another team arrives. The implication is that the connections, who lost Zeno and their direct operative in the Ark, still have the institutional reach to send a retrieval team. What they retrieved, a fragment of Gideon's mutated form, Zeno's distinctive shades, something else entirely, is not specified. The connections are still active. Whatever they are planning, whatever the acquisition from the Ark is intended to enable, is the story's bridge to whatever comes next. This is the Resident Evil universe honoring its own tradition. Each game in the series ends with something addressed and something else revealed. The immediate crisis is resolved. The larger structure of what produces these crises, the organizational and institutional forces that make bioweapons development an ongoing feature of the world rather than a contained historical incident, is not resolved, cannot be resolved in a single story. The war that started with a pharmaceutical company in the mid-20th century and accelerated into the catastrophe of 1998 is not over because one underground facility has been exposed and one man's obsessive project has been ended. But something has changed that is real and permanent. Elpis exists in the world. Grace's report exists in the world. The specific biological legacy of Raccoon City, the latent infections, the Raccoon City Syndrome that was slowly killing the survivors, has a cure. The people who survived 1998 are no longer simply waiting for the disease to reach them. The specific horror of carrying that night inside them, in their own cells, for the rest of their lives, is over. This is what the title means, finally. Requiem, the musical form, the prayer for the dead, the acknowledgement of what has been lost, and the formal act of letting it pass. Leon Kennedy's Requiem revolver laid to rest what needed to be laid to rest. Grace Ashcroft's investigation offered the truth that Alyssa had been trying to tell for 30 years. Spencer's final project provided the cure that undid the worst of what his life's work had produced. Not an ending, not a clean resolution that forecloses everything that follows, but a requiem, a formal, earned, necessary acknowledgement of what happened and what it cost and what it means. For the dead of Raccoon City, for the survivors who carried the night inside them, for everyone who paid for choices they had no part in making. Sleep well. The nightmares, for a little while, are quiet. Welcome back. This is the last part. Take a moment with that. You have traveled through a long story, from the progenitor virus and the founding of Umbrella, through the night that Raccoon City died, and the decades of consequences that followed, through a hotel in the Midwest, and a care facility in Rhodes Hill, and the ruins of a city that was supposed to stay buried. You have followed Grace Ashcroft from the night her mother died to the night she found out why. You have followed Leon Kennedy from the man who arrived at the end of his long war to the man who put on his wedding ring and went home. This final part is not new story. It is the part where we step back and look at the shape of what we have been inside. Because Resident Evil Requiem is about several things simultaneously, in the way that the best entries in this series have always been about several things simultaneously, and understanding what it is about makes the experience of having been through it more complete. It is about the long tail of catastrophe. The specific horror that Requiem adds to the Resident Evil canon is not the zombies or the infected patients or the Nemesis form final boss, impressive as those elements are. The specific horror is the idea that the worst thing that ever happened to a group of people did not end when it appeared to end. That the people who survived Raccoon City were carrying the event inside them in a literal biological sense for 28 years without knowing it. That survival is not the same as escape. That the disaster was still happening, just slowly, in bodies that had rebuilt functional lives around a wound they did not know was still bleeding. This is not only a Resident Evil idea. It maps onto real things that happen to real people. The ways in which catastrophic events leave marks that are not immediately visible and do not resolve on the timescale that the people who were not there tend to assume. The specific framing of Raccoon City Syndrome as a latent infection that activates decades later is a science-fictional version of something true about how damage works. The people most affected by the worst things are often the people who have the least access to the resources that would help address them, and the systems around them tend to normalize what has happened rather than treating it as the ongoing crisis it actually is. The government knew, or could have known, that survivors of Raccoon City might be carrying something. The institutional decision not to look carefully, not to monitor systematically, not to maintain the kind of ongoing medical attention to people who had been through what those survivors had been through, was itself a choice. Not a dramatic evil choice, not the kind of choice that produces a memorable villain. Just the ordinary institutional negligence that emerges when the people making decisions are not the people who will bear the consequences. It is about what legacy means. Spencer's final project is the most complicated element of Requiem's story, and it is worth dwelling on. Here is a man who spent his life building instruments of destruction and then, in the end, built an instrument of healing, who created a virus and then created its antidote, who established a company that poisoned the world and left behind, hidden beneath the most visible expression of that poisoning's consequences, something that could address at least some of what the poison had done. What do we make of this? The story does not tell us. It presents the facts and allows the ambiguity to remain. Spencer's rehabilitation, if it was rehabilitation, happened in private. It was not public accountability. It was not the kind of acknowledgement that would have meant anything to the people who suffered the direct consequences of his decisions. Elpis helps the survivors of Raccoon City. It does not change what happened to them. It does not restore what was taken from them. It is, at best, a partial address of an overwhelming debt. And yet it is real. The antiviral works. The people it saves are really saved. The cure that Spencer built genuinely cures. Whatever his motives, whatever the moral accounting of his life, the last thing he made was something that helps. This is not a simple thing, and the story does not pretend it is simple. It simply holds the complexity of it and allows the complexity to be present. It is about inheritance. Grace Ashcroft did not choose any of this. She was placed in Alyssa's care as an infant, given a specific history and a specific name, and a specific set of circumstances that she had no part in creating and no initial way to understand. The history that shaped her, Spencer's experiments, Umbrella's legacy, the specific night at Wrenwood Hotel, arrived as an ambush rather than as something she had signed up for. This is the situation of anyone who inherits history they did not make, the children of people who did terrible things, the people who live in the places where terrible things happened, the individuals who carry, in their bodies or their families or their communities, the specific biological and cultural and political consequences of decisions made before they were born. Grace's story is about what you do with that, not about escaping it, not about pretending it is not there, but about the specific work of understanding it clearly enough to act within it responsibly. Her report is the expression of that responsibility. She could not undo what Spencer did. She could not bring back Alyssa, or the 5 victims of Raccoon City Syndrome, or the people who died in the hotel and the care center and the Ark. What she could do was tell the truth about what happened. And she did. It is about Leon Kennedy, finally, The game is careful about this. Careful not to make Requiem simply a conclusion to Leon's arc in ways that would diminish Grace's story, which is the primary narrative. But Leon is present throughout in ways that accumulate into something that the ending earns the right to pay off. Leon Kennedy has been fighting bioweapons and the institutional corruption that produces them since he was 21 years old. He has saved people. He has lost people. He has watched the systems he works within fail in the specific ways that systems fail when they are organized around interests that are not the same as the interests of the people they are supposed to serve. He has gotten older. He has carried the weight of Raccoon City inside him, not just emotionally, but literally, as it turned out, and in the form of a T-virus infection that was slowly killing him. The Requiem revolver he carried throughout the game is the story's central symbol, not a weapon of destruction, not something designed to maximize damage or demonstrate power, but something designed specifically for this, for laying to rest what needs to be laid to rest, for providing in the terrible situations that Leon has spent his life navigating, something like finality, the name the director gave to the meaning of the weapon, a requiem for the infected, a way of laying them to peace, is also a description of what the game itself is trying to do for the larger story of the Resident Evil universe. A requiem for Raccoon City, for all the people who died in it and because of it and long after it, for the survivors who spent decades living with what they could never fully leave behind, for the institutions that failed them and the people who tried within those institutions to do better, for the truth that Alyssa Ashcroft spent years trying to tell and that her daughter finally did tell. The wedding ring on Leon's finger in the final scene says what it needs to say without elaborating. He has somewhere to go, someone to go to. The specific ordinary peace that he has been fighting for and around and through for 28 years is available to him. He is going to take it. This is not a perfect ending. It does not pretend to be. The connections are still active. The retrieval team in the Ark's ruins suggests that whoever they are planning something. And the truth is out. But truth being out has never automatically produced justice. The world that exists after Requiem is better than the world that existed before it in specific, measurable ways. Elpis exists. The Ark is exposed. The survivors of Raccoon City have a cure. But it is not a fixed world, not a safe world. Not a world that has figured out how to stop doing the things that produced the catastrophe in the first place. The Resident Evil universe continues, as it has always continued, in the space between crises. Not because the people in it are naive about the nature of what they are dealing with, but because the alternative to continuing is not an option they have chosen to accept. Grace Ashcroft is at her desk. There is a photograph of Alyssa. There is a photograph of Emily. There is a report to write. Because there is always a report to write. Because the work of understanding what happened and communicating that understanding is never finished. Because the next case is already building somewhere in the same world that produced all the previous ones. And somewhere, Leon Kennedy is home. Good night. This has been the entire Resident Evil Requiem story, told slowly, for the hours when sleep is far away. Raccoon City's long night is quieter now than it was. The dead have their requiem. The living have a little more time. Rest. The nightmares can wait until morning.